Ladies and gentlemen, we would now like to begin our second part of the workshop, so I please ask you to return to your seats. As I mentioned earlier, during this time, we will take questions from the audience for our presenters. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and a JITI staff will provide a microphone for you so that you may introduce yourself and ask a question. So they're around the room, and they will come by. Thank you for your cooperation. To start off, though, I would like to ask our speakers if they have any questions or comments for each other, and whether they had anything they felt like they wanted to incorporate hearing each other's presentations. If not, we will turn to the audience. Mr. Hart, if you'd like to begin, if you have any comments.
Well, I think for me, and I'm very appreciative of my co-panelists, but it is the appreciation of the size and scope of the threat and the hazard, or their perspectives of looking at those. That's very, very important for us as in terms of emergency management. I've always likened it to like a boxer, in that a boxer has a plan, and that boxer trains, prepares for that fight that he or she might be in. But I would venture to say that the first time that boxer gets hit square on the button, that plan probably changes. So then it reverts to the planning and the effectiveness of that planning. And we heard comments about looking at things, looking in out of the box perspective, or being able to be agile. So as I listened to the two presenters, it was what was their approach to planning and the steps that they were taking to make sure that they were, their programs were able to respond. And listening, got close to me was, of course, the importance of training and exercises, especially exercising.
Interesting. Mr. Douglas.
Well, a couple of things, especially when you're dealing with the federal government and administrations change, and sometimes the players that you have to communicate with will also change. And the only question I have for you is, did you appreciate our approach in that we reach out, and because we constantly want to find out who we need to talk to, not in the heat of battle, but beforehand. So we'll reach out well in advance, so we'll have a number to call. We'll do it at the local level, the state level, and also the federal level, so we can know. And not only that, we document everything. So and the reason we document is because it's funny how people will forget what you said, and you have to have that paperwork to remind them. And do you appreciate that when we?
Very much so. Capturing the lessons, turning lessons observed into validated lessons learned is very, very important. And that's one of the hallmarks of preparedness, that we look at what we have experienced. We make note of those areas, of course, where we need to improve, but equally important, we capture those best practices and we share those. That is the key. Sometimes we focus so much on the negative that we forget about the things that we do well every day. So we need to reinforce that.
And I just have one more thing, and that's, Doctor, you mentioned there's an increase in certain types of activity. One, it is easy to measure the changes due to climate change. That we can see and we can measure. The one that, the variable that's unknown is with regard to earthquake or seismic activity, even with early warning systems. And one of the things that we're looking at is issues such as where do we build based on occurrences, and also one of the elements that I see, and Alaska is probably perfect, when you take a look at the land that you build on because of the potential for liquefaction. And I wonder if that's something that is looked at in Japan, and do they modify design just because earthquakes won't go away and the need for transportation won't go away. So how do you designed for that.
Thank you for that question. In Japan, there's some disappointment as an engineer because when we have to think about where we should locate a station, then that means a social impact and also economical impact. So it's not only engineering impact. And so you talked about disaster impact and then also the transit needs. However, we have to sometimes prioritize economic activities over disaster prevention. And currently, we have to think about what we need to prioritize comparing to societal and also economical impact over disaster prevention. And also, not like the United States, we only have the land mass very limited. And so we can just put a line for tracks and also trains. And so I think that our options are more limited than the United States. So I'd like to ask you for suggestions regarding risk communication. So you talked about communication and also the importance of having a clear communication. So you talked about workshops and also training with stakeholders. And so in Japan, we are trying to start training with the government participation and also stakeholders. And of course, Japanese rail systems are very sound and safe. However, it is difficult to involve or build momentum to have more people participate in disaster prevention and also understanding rail systems. So what do you say for that? Do you have any hints and also feedback?
Just briefly, if you go back 100 years in the United States and you were to build a rail line, you could build that rail line within sometimes 6 months or even a year from conception to finish. There is no way in the world that that will happen today because there are so many environmental impact reports and studies that must be conducted first. And also, we have the luxury of having so many options with regard to land, so we can move around and design around certain issues. The only thing I don't know is with regard to Japan, if Japan has, of course there are standards for construction, but sometimes some would say that the requirements in the United States are so onerous that it takes forever to build anything because not only do you have the reports that are required, but you have feedback from the other stakeholders, which will be the people who live in that area. So to me, the best thing you can do is remain transparent, communicate as openly as possible with those, with a slight political spin because you want to get it done. But if there are any risks, then you make the public aware of what those risks are and let everyone reach or draw consensus about how to proceed with a project. That's what we do.
Well, that's very fascinating also because I personally do not have a background in rail, so this is me as a layman not understanding exactly how this all works. But how soon do you notify the public when you know a disaster is approaching? At what point is it that you tell someone it's time to, I don't know, take cover, or is it without causing panic? I don't know if maybe Kawagoe-san wants to ask first, and then Mr. Douglas, if you have any thoughts. I don't know if Ms. Hart, if you have thoughts too, you're welcome to answer this question.
July this year, I showed some of the examples. So some of the heavy rains during summertime this year, the railway systems in the West Japan, we stopped the operation 2 days prior to the prediction of the rain. So maybe 3 years ago, so we started this suspension and also weather prediction type of practices. And so based on weather predictions, we were able to involve railway systems and also businesses surrounding the rail systems. And regarding involving the public, we started communicating with mass media so that they can communicate with the public. However, because Japanese rail systems are so punctual and sound and safe, maybe people really didn't think or take our warnings so seriously. Maybe people are thinking that, oh, maybe this rail system is okay. It's gonna move anyway. So that was somewhat a reaction from the public. And so customers ended up coming to the stations even though the train systems were suspended because customers' expectations are so high for our punctual operation. And so we still have to improve our communication to the public.
I look at this three different ways in brief. The first one is, if you're going to construct something, it really is important to have discussions with all stakeholders before you put shovels into the ground, whatever could possibly be, whether it be earthquake, potential flood, collapse, some of our areas, methane gas, and that we incorporate various construction techniques in the building of a thing. And that way the public is aware of what's going on. And also we listen to their feedback so we can reach agreement. However, if there's something that's ongoing, what we do is we'll communicate with, like you said, mass media and let them know what's going on. In the case, for us, probably the two that come to mind, not so much flood, although there's an exposure, it would be earthquake and fire. In the case of earthquake, it will become self-evident. And because a lot of people will not want to get on a subway if we are in the middle of an earthquake. But the truth is, the subway is probably one of the safest places to be in Los Angeles, just because of the way it's constructed. Light rail, we have certain procedures, and we notify them in the event of, and then there's a big slowdown. And everyone, reasonable actors will understand that that's the case. However, I will mention one thing that happened to occur. I was in Japan, and I was riding the rail system there, not the high speed, but the regular rail. And I can't remember the line that I was on, but I was going, briefly, my son was teaching in Japan for 3 years, and we wanted to go to Tokyo Disney. And there's a train that you had to take from the central station area to get out to it. And there was a heavy windstorm event that day, and as a result of it, that train did not run. They wouldn't run it. It was something about, there was some exposure to wind, and they stopped the train. But they announced it to the people, and I didn't see anyone griping or complaining. So the same thing is universal, I believe, and that is if people are aware of the exposure, they are accepting of what it is. I mean, what do you expect? So as long as you make people aware of what's going on, communicate openly, then I think you can mitigate a lot of problems going forward.
I think for the events that we're talking about, we have a system throughout the United States, the alert notification systems, the emergency alert network, which we've also integrated the public alert and warning system, or IPAWS. But there are two components of it. It's not only the means in which you're going to communicate, but the all-important, when you're talking about crisis communications, what is it that we want, what does the population need to know, those who are impacted by the disaster, and then, very important, what do we want them to do? And making sure that our message to them is very clear, it's very concise. If I were to bring up there are certain disasters, certain events that you may put out an order such as shelter in place. Well, depending on the community that you're talking to, they may have several different definitions of what that means to them. So at a time of emergency, making sure that our communications is, again, it's very concise, it's very targeted, and it motivates people to take the actions we need them to take. So again, there's two components. The means in which you're going to get your message to those impacted, but then how you're going to, what you need to communicate to them, so they can then act effectively and do the necessary things you need them to do.
I know in both, at least in Mr. Kawagoe's, and I think both of yours as well, you spoke about how sometimes disasters are unpredictable, that you can't tell when it's about to happen. Well, what what's a better way to take action ahead of time, or maybe a better way to phrase that is, how do you use weather forecasts to I guess predict what's about to happen, or is it just not possible? I guess Mr. Kawagoe, you spoke about prediction a little bit, so.
Yes, just to add, what I have said is that it is not able to clearly predict. You say, as far as location is actually, it is easy to, it is able to predict. However, the timing is something that we cannot accurately predict. So if you look at the data and then you say, this is the if this amount of rainfall falls, then this would happen. So this is a type of prediction we can make. So we can base our decision of suspending operation based on that type of information. However, if you look at the what kind of capacity we have, but if you look at the external force as far as the weather forecast, or the precision of the weather forecast itself is not something that the railway industry can really be involved in. And then there are other observation technologies that can make gradual development. I believe that in the future we can all put all these technologies together to make use of this kind of external tools for our usage. And in terms of the disaster prediction itself, I believe will become more and more possible. In other words, I think in terms of railroad prediction, we need to reach that kind of point. Of course, if we can spend as much money as we can, then we can make a lot of progress, but that's not really the case. So that is my comment.
The only thing I'll add to that, and I happen to agree, you can't really predict. Several years ago, right after Katrina, there was a risk conference being held in New Orleans within a year after that. And the risk manager of the transit agency there knew I was going to be in town and picked me up and showed me around. And what I saw was devastating. You had their trolley cars, which are classic cars that have run since the beginning of time in New Orleans, and also many of their bus infrastructure, rolling stock was all just really destroyed. And what they hadn't anticipated, and a lesson I learned from, was they knew that the storm was coming, and they prepared for that initial hit. But what they didn't really factor in was the breach of the levee system, which is what led to the flooding in certain areas like the Ninth Ward and so on. So the question that I had and the lesson I learned from that was, okay, certainly someone must have conducted some type of an assessment about the integrity of that levee system. And also, because any of the rolling stock that went to the higher ground areas survived. And you can look on the internet and see photos of how devastated the buildings were and the rolling stock, and it took them forever to get the trolley system back online. So the question is, and for us that we asked today is, okay, this event can happen, we don't know. What are our plans for the just-in-case type scenario? And then after that, how bad can it possibly be? What is this event, the proximate cause that can lead to other types of losses, and how do you mitigate against those? The only thing, as I mentioned in my presentation, is static property or real property is not going to go anywhere, so it's probably going to take a hit. The best you can do is secure whatever movable rolling stock that you have available, and make sure you have some plans in place to minimize damage.
Do you have something to add, or you?
Well, I would just say, from a preparedness standpoint, we should always find ourselves in a state of that we are assessing our plans and our planning. We are always looking at our capabilities in terms of what we have and what we need. And then the most important thing is that we practice and we challenge the norm. We have to do that. We've seen the recent events. We have to look at those cascading effects. I would use the example that at one time in our lives, as far back as grade school, we probably participated in something as simple as a fire drill. But if you remember those days when you all lined up in two and you held one another's hand, did they ever cut the lights out? Probably they didn't. But what would cutting the lights out represent? Smoke, vision being obscured. What would have happened then? Would the conditions have been the same? Probably not. However, if you practice, and again, you test the norm, you push the envelope, and you look at the probability of what could happen, and you exercise within that context, you would then be better prepared. Another challenge that we have, and I didn't mention it in my earlier remarks, is that we have to maintain that situational awareness across the spectrum in which now people receive information. There are various forms that are being used now in which people go to for a source of information, and we must understand what those are, and we must be able to communicate effectively within those forms. But we cannot give the same message in a context that one size fits all. It does not, and that could impede our response to any disaster.
Okay, great. I saw a hand for questions. Is that correct? Yes, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, John Wetmore with pedestrians.org. The Alaska quake recently, Alaska Railroad shut down. They were back up in a week, but a lot of the repairs are going to have to wait until spring for permanent repairs. How does it affect disaster response when you're in a cold climate and it's winter?
Okay. In 2016, we conducted a national level exercise, and it was on the anniversary of the Great Alaskan Quake in 1964. And one of the lessons learned that we recognize, one of the most significant, is that the airfield at the time was severely damaged. So we had, well, in our scenario, excuse me, in our exercise scenario, the airfield was damaged. And so we had to prioritize the efforts that was going into the airfield. On this end, the pipe was obviously this wide, but on the other end, it was a spigot in terms of our ability to get resources on the ground, and more importantly, move forward to make a difference, to change the outcomes for the survivors. The lesson learned from that was that we needed to create within our operations in the National Response Coordination Center a air movement group, an air mobility group, and we did an examination of what needed to go first. As you can imagine, in the initial hours after a major quake like that, and that was in our scenario, was a 9.6, that getting emergency medical supplies and the equipment there with the personnel following, that once they hit the ground, they were able to immediately be put into the operational place. So that was one of the lessons learned. As far as the challenge in operating in what would be a very austere environment, it would be a challenge, and we would probably go, depending on what is happening at the national level, but we would be very dependent upon our colleagues in DOD and their ability to immediately mobilize, equipped with the necessary equipment for cold weather operations, and a lot of what you see in the civilian side probably to follow. But we are also, for those key assets, we have undergone in FEMA efforts to make sure that they have the right equipment in the right amount so they can immediately deploy. But the larger force that would be required, it would take some time for them to come forward. I hope that answered your question.
Let's see. I believe you were first, so go ahead. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Kunio Kikuchi with Washington Research, formerly with the World Bank. I have a question and comment about Dr. Kawagoe's slide, where you showed the percentages of accidents, and the slide showed and you did not comment. The largest component was falling trees, was about 30-some%. The rest of them were much less. But a little bit of history is that in 1949, there was a typhoon, and by then the hillsides in Japan were all barren because during the war they cut down all the trees, or most of the trees, and the landslide resulting from the typhoon caused a large damage in Izu Peninsula, and Japan government went into a national tree planting campaign, and probably with the approval of GHQ, they planted mainly sugi trees, which are essentially California redwoods, or similar to the redwoods, with the idea that in about 30 years they should be harvested and Japan wouldn't have to import trees. That didn't happen in Japan because by 1980 it was too much cheaper to import wood timber from Canada and US. So those trees are getting bigger and bigger. And lately, with the heavy rains, once the trees on the top of the hills and the start falling, then it brings down the entire hillside. And all of a sudden this year in Hiroshima and with a little earthquake in Hokkaido too, the whole hillside collapses. And they call it landslides, but actually it's the failure of the entire hill because these very large and heavy redwoods keep on falling at the top and coming through down to the mountain all the way. And if there's a railroad track down there, it'll be covered by debris for months sometimes. And now the trees are each year getting bigger. I was told by my friends here that Amtrak started cutting down trees on the slopes. Is that what you are doing, or is there research about these so-called landslides, which are caused by oversized trees? Because if you don't cut the trees, they'll fall eventually. Thank you.
Thank you. Mainly, 杉の木、あと
So we're talking about sugi and also bamboo trees. Japan actually have a lot of bamboo trees. And as you mentioned, we do have a historical background. The sugi trees are actually quite weak, so it is they easily collapse and they easily slide down, fall down. And another background I'd like to talk about is the railroad. You see, if the area is not managed by the railroad companies, then the companies cannot simply cut down the trees. So the railroad companies themselves will talk to the people who own the land to cut down the trees. However, these are mainly owned by individuals, so many times they refuse to cut down the trees. And these are, we're talking about a lot of these areas are remote areas within the mountains and right against the slope. And when there's a strong wind, there were there are frequent operation suspension in terms in order to avoid a disaster. So yeah, so in other words, my answer is yes, we are cutting down trees, we are making efforts. However, in terms of, because of the issues of who owns the land, we are not able to comprehensively take care of these trees. And what we are asking is really to ask them to cut down the trees that do not belong to them.
Are there any one hand in the back.
Hi there, I'm Brianne Eby with the Eno Center for Transportation. There was some discussion of coordination between different levels of government in terms of addressing disaster prevention and disaster responses, but I'm wondering about coordination between different governmental agencies. So I'm thinking, for example, at the city level, we have the Department of Transportation and the Department of, here in DC, Environment and Environment and Energy, I think, that has to coordinate on sustainability or climate change plans. And so I'm wondering what role that currently plays, so cross-agency collaboration, and if there's any room for improvement and what role it should be playing in the future.
Let me just mention from our perspective what we do. And before I answer your question, I just wanted to thank this gentleman here for the information regarding the history of Japan with the trees and everything. I did not know that, and I'm always fascinated to hear, what happened then and what it leads to today, so thank you for that. With regard to your question, we have emergency operations centers at various levels of government, first starting within intra-agency, but that would incorporate all of the various operational units within our organization. That in turn goes up to the municipal areas, and so that will incorporate, to address your question specifically, all of the various key players within that, the stakeholders. So that could be emergency response, and that could be fire, police, health services, all of that within that. So that way that information is disseminated to the various users within that level. And then up to the state level, the same type of structure occurs. And I would assume going up to the national level, the same thing. You're going to have everything from defense to FEMA to whatever that could be impacted or needs to know so they can marshal their resources to respond to what occurred at the local level.
And to echo that, embedded within the National Incident Management System, that is what we refer to as the National Response Coordinating Structure, which makes up all of the agencies, government agencies, but as I mentioned earlier when I used my discussion of the whole community, it's that public and private partnership, it's all the federal agencies, it's all branches of, all elements of government that come together under a unified system. The most important thing about the National Incident Management System is it provided a structure. It provided a process in which we would, as the federal, that if you recall in my slide, those 4 legs, how we would all come together as a system to respond to a disaster. Are there rooms for improvement? As I mentioned, each year, and depending on the severity of the disasters that we have seen, we have learned from those. And the system is dynamic, that each year, again, we have identified what those lessons learned, what those lessons have been, and we aggressively go out to change our federal interagency operating plans, our national response frameworks, but we make a concerted effort to make changes. One of the also strengths of the program, as an outcome of the Homeland Security Act in 2002, there used to be this sequence of exercises which was called the Top Officials Exercises. It mandated that the Chief Executive of the United States, along with the major cabinet officials, participate in an exercise. With some changes now, it's called the National Exercise Program. There are some 150 to 200 exercises per year that we look at, exercises that range from matters of strategic issues of policy to tactical issues in terms of how we would on the ground respond to an emergency. And all of those, all the results of that data, that is all those events that are learned from that participation in those exercises and real world events are part of a national report that we identify, and we attempt to make changes and correct any deficiencies that are noted throughout the emergency preparedness continuum.
We're running out of time, so this will be our final question.
Good afternoon. I'm Tony Tisdale. I'm with the Federal Transit Administration. First, I want to commend all 3 speakers for the excellent information you shared with us today. I've learned quite a few things today. So, Mr. Hart, I understand, I'm told that the National Response Framework is in the process of being updated. If that's true, then my question is, how will the Lifelines initiative that you mentioned during your presentation, well, the question is, will that be an integral part of the update? And if not, then how is FEMA going to ensure that the Lifelines initiative, that all the federal agencies that participate in the emergency support function program all speaking the same language?
Okay. This is what I believe will happen, and of course I have to defer to our folks in the Office of Response and Recovery. But if history, based on what has happened in the past, what will happen as we look at those core as we look at the core capabilities, as we look at the federal interagency operating plans, I think what we're going to do is you're going to see not only across the 5 mission areas, but you will see the integration of the lifelines. So just like we categorize the core capabilities along the 5 mission areas, I anticipate that we will integrate the lifelines as a subset of that. And so we will take each one of those core capabilities and associate them with these specific lifelines, which is kind of already done when you look at the core capabilities. So that's what I think that's the logical direction that it should go. But it will be subject to, of course, interagency coordination and collaboration.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for your participation. This concludes today's workshop. The content of this workshop will again be posted on our website. If you liked our workshop today, we would be happy if you tweeted us or added us on Facebook. In addition, so you're aware, in March of 2019, in conjunction with the Cherry Blossom Festival, JITI will be hosting a U.S.-Japan Tourism and Exchange seminar. So please look out for information on that, and we hope you're able to join us for that. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope you have a pleasant evening. Thank you.